Well, hello, everybody. Georgette Heyer's Regency world has inspired a generation of writers, especially in the genre of Regency romance. But times have changed since Heyer wrote her stories, just as they've changed since the Regency. In this session, we're going to talk a little about Georgette Heyer's legacy globally on some very successful authors in the present moment. New Heyer fans are being made every year, and Regency romance is at the moment the genre of the moment with the success of Bridgerton. But how do contemporary writers wrestle with writing about the Regency? My lovely guests who are going to help me understand these questions are Mary Bly, who is a Shakespeare professor and chair of the English department at Fordham University, but better known as New York Times bestselling author of historical novels, Eloisa James. She's published over 30 books, translated in 26 languages with sales worldwide of 7 million. She has won the Rita Award, the romance industry's top honour. And in 2012, she was the first romance writer asked to give a talk at the National Book Festival in Washington, DC. And she is very happy to announce here that she will be writing introductions for a reissue of Georgette Heyer's romances. Please welcome Eloisa. I'll call you Eloisa for this, given that we've got you here in your Regency romance mode. #1 New York Times bestselling author Stephanie Laurens is also here. She began writing romances as an escape from the dry world of professional science. Her hobby quickly became a career when her first novel was accepted for publication. And with entirely becoming alacrity, she gave up writing about facts in favour of writing fiction. Though she just confessed to me off screen that there's a lot of storytelling goes on in science as well. Laurens has published over 70 works of historical romance, including 40 New York Times bestsellers. Stephanie, that's 40 more than I will ever have. Welcome, Stephanie. And last but definitely not least, Jennifer Kloester is an author of both fiction and non-fiction and has written extensively about best-selling British novelist Georgette Heyer, who we're here to celebrate. In 2005, Random House UK published Georgette Heyer's Regency World, an illustrated companion to Heyer's 26 Regency novels. And in 2011, again with Random House, she published Georgette Heyer, Biography of a Bestseller, which I'm sure most of you have on your shelves at home. Inspired by Heyer's witty and stylish novels, Jennifer has also written her own fiction for both adults and younger readers. Welcome, Jen. Do we have sound for you, Jen? Could you just say thank you again?
Yes.
Good. All right. And my name is Professor Kim Wilkins from the University of Queensland, and I am going to be the person asking them questions today. So let's go. So, ladies, writers, it's been 100 years since Georgette Heyer published The Black Moth. This year, it's been 100 years. But she's continued to speak to us as readers and as writers. And what I want to know first is, what was it about Heyer's craft that attracted you in the first place? Eloisa, do you want to answer first?
Sure. I discovered Georgette Heyer in a public library, because I grew up on a farm, so outside of town of 2000, and thank goodness this library was buying all of her books in hardcover. And at that point, I'd read a lot of Harlequin Presents, and I'd read Barbara Cartland. And Georgette was the first romance I ever read where people were funny, where they were witty, where wit was even something desirable or interesting on the page. So I fell in love with yes, the main couples, but also the way in which there was an ironic sort of wittiness to everything, where, just to give you an example, like, some character will come on burbling an entire paragraph and then end up with saying, I'm just tongue-tied in shock. And then the hero will say, dryly, not so you'd notice, or, not perceptibly. And I loved those moments. So for me, that was a revelation.
Oh, lovely. Jen, do you want to give us what was
well, I first read Georgette Heyer in the tiny YWCA library in a very small mining town in Papua New Guinea, in the jungle. And then I reread her in the desert in Bahrain, because libraries in both countries had all of Georgette Heyer's novels. And I had I adored the humour. She made me laugh out loud, which most writers can't do. Takes a fair bit to make me laugh out loud, but I just loved her ironic sense of humour and the way she exploded the sentimental romance. But I also was fascinated by her seamless integration of history with fiction, to the point where you didn't always know if a character was a real historic character or someone she'd made up. And I just thought that was amazing. And the last thing was that incredible ability to create a character who might only be on the page for a paragraph, but they are fully fleshed and real, and you feel as if you know them. And I'm still in awe of that skill.
It's amazing. Stephanie?
Well, I first started reading Georgette Heyer courtesy of my mother, who got all Georgette Heyer's books lent to her by somebody at her work. So Mum would read it and then I would read it and it get passed around. And that was my first introduction to romance, because I was quite young. It would have been 13 at most. And in those days, that was young. But the thing that completely absorbed me with Heyer's novels from that point on was that she had the ability to create the worlds, or create the world that she was writing in such incredible authenticity that you totally believed it. You just completely bought into it. And as part of that was the characters, that I still think she has possibly the greatest both range of characters that have subtlety. They are not just straightforward, you know, this is the trope and this is how you're going to be. They actually have depth, and they have multi-dimensional, they're multi-dimensional. So that to me it was the two things together, the characters plus the history, which I loved anyway. I love that period. And I've sort of, over the years, I'd researched quite a lot of just the plain history of that period. But to have it all put together was just wonderful.
I'm so glad you mentioned the Regency setting, Stephanie, because what I wanted to talk a little bit about that. So all of you have written stories set in the Regency, and there's a sense in which Heyer's Regency England has become this distinct story world that certain types of stories play out in, and obviously chief amongst them is the romance. What do you think the Regency period offers the romance writer that other periods potentially don't? And I might go with Jen first. I'm just swapping around who answers the questions in what order. What do you think the Regency offers?
Heyer's pretty extraordinary in that she's one of the authors who actually confined herself to the true Regency, the 9-year period from 1811 to 1820. And it was an extraordinary period in that I think there was a huge amount happening on so many fronts, politically, with the Napoleonic Wars, huge political upheaval, the Regency itself, where, you know, the king is declared mad and his son becomes Prince Regent. You know, that's very unusual. And but it's also this extraordinary period. It's the last great era of the horse and carriage. And of course, they are incredibly important in that whole Regency storytelling world now. But also fashion. Men had moved out of the 18th century, the great, colourful, incredibly rich, to the much more sort of Beau Brummel laid down rules of much crisper, cleaner lines and look. And Heyer makes a huge amount of mileage out of those things, women's fashion, men's fashion. And the settings. So I think it's a period of it's sort of the presage of enormous change that's about to start to happen. So it's that kind of linking period between the huge excesses of the 18th century. So you still got those excesses, but we're moving towards the Victorian era. And so there's enormous, there's great seams of gold to be mined, I think, from that historical period, that short historical period. Even though the modern Regency now covers sort of 1780 to 1820.
What do you think, Stephanie?
Well, as someone who has written from 1780s through to now I'm at 1860, that it's one of the things I have noticed because most of my original work was in the true Regency period up until about very early 20s. And then having moved beyond that, purely because I'm now writing about the children of the couples that I originally wrote about, then I did really find a big change in societal attitudes, what was acceptable. And I've sort of been asked this question for like many, many years now, literally decades. And I think one of the things that for me makes the Regency itself so useful for modern novelists is that it is actually, I mean, you have to remember that we almost all of us write about, I mean, our people, our heroes and heroines, our protagonists are all of a certain class. And, you know, by and large, we're writing about the aristocracy or at least the nobility, you know, at that sort of level. And for those people, the Regency was actually the first time that both men and women, but particularly women, got the chance to make a decision about marriage. Prior to that, marriage was actually much more a civil contract. It was more about moving money and estates and that sort of thing, dynastic type marriages. Whereas in the Regency, it became much, much more, and this was really coming from the sort of the Romantic age that preceded it, then it became much more a question of if the woman was in a sufficient position that she could exercise this, a question of, do I marry for love? Do I marry for money, essentially, and social position? Or do I not marry at all? And those three questions are the questions women can, you know, essentially face today. So you've got an immediate echo between then and now. And that echo is much softer when you go into the intermediate years. It's much harder for a woman to be really independent in the Victorian era, for instance, particularly in the middle Victorian era and the later Victorian era. So to me, that was one of the great things that the Regency, and as I said, having now written beyond it, so I keep coming up against the limitations of the later periods. That's one thing that is really definite for the Regency and not very many other places in history. So
that's fascinating. Thank you, Stephanie. Do you have something to add to that, Eloisa?
I'll just build on what both of you said, which was so interesting. I think that, I mean, and you brought this up, there's a difference between the Regency and Georgette Heye's Regency, right? So just to build on what Stephanie said, I think that class is one of the most fascinating things in the Regency period, and she plays on that relentlessly throughout. And you know, you can go and look at 1950s Britain and see what she was doing and what she was doing in the books, and there's this enormous resonance. But when you see in the books the question of, do you marry up, or is there a mushroom person involved who's sprung up during the night? You know, is there a merchant, and how do we speak about them? That's something where, as you're saying, in the Georgian period, you know, it was a civil contract and people would live apart once they had children. But in the Regency period, you have very strict, much stricter sort of laws governing what men and women did, especially unmarried men and women. And then, you know, you go into the Victorian where it kind of goes crazy. So you're in this interstitial moment when class is still really fiercely guarded, and behavior is guarded, but it's still broken a lot. I mean, I'll just say, as you know, in the Shakespeare, because I'm a Shakespeare professor, you know, 44% of women who were actually married were pregnant, and it hadn't changed all that much by the Regency period, except in this sort of upper class where we talk, you know, gentry, nobility, or aristocracy, so the upper echelon. So I think it's fascinating to look at what she did in terms of class and rules governing behavior, but then also to keep in mind that it really is her, you know, the quintessential bored rake, right? She did this over and over again. He's so bored. There's nothing for him to see. That, I think, is a Regency. You don't get that kind of feeling. And she pulled that from the Regency and made it into a huge trope where and then the heroine's the only person who interested him, whether she's 17 or she's 26.
Well, how about we talk about sex? Because whatever really happened in the Regency bedroom, sex has been written about in the Regency romance in a range of different ways. Obviously, Heyer's sensuality is hinted at, though there's a chapter of Venetia that's full of so many phallic images that it makes me laugh every time I read it. I'll point it out to you later if you like, ladies. Some contemporary writers go the whole way compared to Heyer. What's your preference? And why? For writing, but also for reading. What's your preference? Stephanie, do you want to go first? I'm handing this one to you first.
Oh, okay. I don't know about preference because, well, actually the answer is the same for both preference in reading and how I write. And that is that it's actually about A, the story, and B, meaning the actual two characters, right? How their romance is going to go. In some cases, it's almost impossible to get a sex scene in the story. Sorry, it's just not. And those books have to be, to me, it's always organic, right? So if it's not there, it's not there. You can't force it in. But also, if it is there, then you can, make of it as much as you like. But to me, it has to be carried as part of the story. And if it's not part of the story, to me, that's a badly written book. And it's not one I was probably going to finish. So, yeah, it's interesting to me that this is still a sort of like a distinction. I look at some of the books I write now, which, as I say, I've moved into the Victorian era, but also some of the books I wrote earlier, which have more a detective slant, and they don't have very much sex in them at all. And yet that's something I was known for writing in the beginning. And to a large extent, that was back then because that's what readers expected too. And reader expectation in romance now is much, much broader. Whereas when I started in the early 90s in the US, not in England, my first 8, which were in England, published in England, they don't have very much sex in them at all because that just wasn't what the English readership and English editors wanted. But when I moved to the US, well, it was all full slather, and they expected you to have a lot of actually on the page sex. So, it's a combination of how your storyline and your character arcs are going to work, but it's also influenced by reader expectation. I feel much freer now to be able to just write the way that it should be, rather than be aware that I have no sex scene in this.
It's page 60. Where sex? Eloisa.
Well, I should say that Venetia was my absolute dead favorite for many years, which it is definitely the sexiest book she wrote. So I actually, I like books with sex in them, but I will say from the point of view of a writer, what Stephanie is saying, where that's where you don't finish, it's the hardest scene to write. Because in my point of view, if there isn't actual movement in the relationship in that scene, in other words, if bad sex, for example, if there isn't some transition where they actually learn something about each other, or they confess something, or they just become closer, then it's really, really a waste of space, and people will quit reading. And that makes it the hardest of all, because you're following a plot line. You've got, maybe a few villains coming in, whatever you've got going, an evil sister or something. Boom, you just have the two of them. You just have the two of them on the page, and you have this tremendous vulnerability on the part of the hero as well, which can also be very difficult to work with. So I love scenes with sex. I write them regularly, but I do think that it's the watershed moment for a writer, if they can write them well. even if that means writing bad sex well. I think Georgette would have written great bad sex. I would have loved to see, for example, a sex scene in Cotillion, because that's one of my favorite heroes. He's completely beta. I mean, I think he would have been great in the bedroom. It would have been fascinating. So
we'll speculate later on who would make the, no, we won't. All right, Jen, what's your answer to the question?
I love Georgette, and I think there's a lot of sensuality and tension, but she herself was much more cerebral than tactile. I think I said that in the biography. And she was much more interested in the relationship between the hero and heroine, the secondary characters, in terms of how they got on, the friendships that they developed, the way they came to know each other. And I think sex was not required to demonstrate any of those things. So she wouldn't have occurred to her. And of course, you know, writing sex when she was writing from 1921 onwards, forget it. I mean, you know, Lady Chatterley's Lover, they had the huge court case. That wasn't the only court case in the 1950s for, you know, trying to ban and censor books that were deemed to be, you know, inappropriate and unacceptable. And so it would not have been an option for her. And I suspect by the time she got to, you know, the 1960s, when you could start doing a lot more writing about sex, she was never going to change her habits. So for her, it wouldn't have been an option. I'm happy to read a sex scene if it's really well written and it's organic. But for me, it needs to be, as Stephanie and Eloisa have said, it needs to be a legitimate part of the story, not gratuitous. I recently stopped reading a Regency on page 2 because just straight up, it was just sex in a wardrobe. And I'm just like, no, like, what was that for? And to me, that was just completely gratuitous. And I hadn't even had a chance to get to know the characters to decide whether or not I actually wanted to effectively witness them being intimate. And so that I just, you know, put that one away. I'm not going to read that one. But that's just me. And it's very subjective and very personal. So I don't look for sex in a novel. And if it turns up, it's because it needs to be there. And that's great, you know, that if it progresses the story and shows me more of the characters, or it's a natural event in a story that's convincing me, you know. But yeah, I mean, we live in a very different time from the one Georgette Heyer lived in. And that's one of the reasons you don't have overt sex in her novels.
Yeah, obviously, yeah. Maybe those characters were just looking to get to Narnia, Jen.
Yeah. And of course, she was all about, you know, comedy too. She always felt that her writing style was a mixture of Sheridan and Austen. She was writing comedies of manners, ironic comedies. Romance was secondary to that. I mean, she would say, you know, another Frippery Regency romance, but that isn't how she genuinely thought about her novels. She took them very seriously indeed. And she was probably one of the most natural writers there's ever been, I think. I mean, she was born, I think she was a born writer, genuinely a born writer, because it just came to her naturally. Yeah. And she wrote them so quickly.
Yeah. So last question, I want you all to think about this as writers. What have you learned about writing from your favourite Heyer novel? And that means that you have to name your favourite Heyer novel and then name what you've learned from writing about it. I might go Eloisa, Stephanie, and then Jen. I'm going to mute my microphone because my cat's trying to get in at my door and he's making a terrible noise. So Eloisa, take it away.
My favorite Georgette novel, besides Venetia, is The Grand Sophie. And I learned an enormous amount from The Grand Sophie, because by the time I read it and reread it a million times, I knew very well the trope of the hero who comes along and saves the heroine. And remember, I had got Barbara Cartland's from my grandmother, and he was always sweeping in and going, "You little fool," and picking her up and taking her off. I knew that inside out. And The Grand Sophie was the first book I read where the heroine is clearly the alpha. She sweeps in, she saves everything, and the hero, if we think of a protective alpha, the crucial thing is that he can solve things, among the people he loves. The hero is has got himself engaged to a detestable woman, but he also is not noticed that his younger siblings are in trouble. And Sophie saves the day. And so for me, that was a huge revelation. I would say in terms of writing, though, she saves the hero. So that incredibly delicate balancing act where we really do want to see the hero not be totally inept, right? Even a beta hero like in the Cotillion is incredibly good at solving problems. She manages to bring him around and make him into an acceptable, wonderful hero by the end. And for me, that moment of finessing where she lets him be horrible and then she recovers him was something I had never read before. And I read very rarely now. I mean, it's not something, frankly, that I would take on myself. And I just have so much respect for it. So go, Georgette.
Yes, go, Georgette. Stephanie.
Well, I have a similar but somewhat different take, and that is that to me, it is the subtleties that she taught me about, how to portray the subtle changes, such as Eloisa just mentioned, that transform, subtleties of transformation, and how to get that on the page. And funnily enough, the book that sort of keeps popping into my head is Friday's Child. And there you have, you know, a situation that, I mean, even in the back cover blurb, they start off with the other woman, right? That's the first name you read. And she is not the heroine. The heroine is on the third paragraph of that blurb. And you sort of think, yeah, and yet when you see her, well, it's not massage it, but she actually gets her characters to transform into the ones that fit together, and a recognition of that fitting. And, you know, again, it's something a bit like the Grand Sophie change. Transformation is what I've taken from Georgette, you know, that it's a very important thing and it can happen in quite a dramatic fashion.
And Jen?
Well, I'm still in awe of her skill as a writer. It's not just her ability to create memorable characters who live and breathe for the reader. It's also her remarkable plotting, her extraordinary imbroglio endings that just bring how she manages the cast of characters too. You know, she often has loads of minor characters, but they all live and breathe for you, as I said before. The dialogue is just sparkling, and the vocabulary. I mean, her memory just must have been extraordinary. You know, I think one of the great tells of Heyer's legacy, her enduring legacy, and the fact that she does endure 100 years later, is that it's impossible to pick a favourite novel, actually, I think. When you say, what's your favourite? Well, you know, Cotillion springs to mind, and then I think, well, I adore A Civil Contract. What about Sylvester, Frederica, Friday's Child, you know, Talisman Ring, Black Sheep? It's really impossible, and yet each of those books has its own cast of characters. And people will sometimes talk about stereotypes. Oh, she has this cast of characters and they're all the same. It's actually not true. Every book, she brings something new to every book. In terms of what I've learned from her, oh gosh, I wish I could actually really genuinely imbibe the many, many, many lessons in her novels, in her skill set. I wish I could master those same skills. It's a dream, you know. I'm writing a Regency at the moment, and you know, even after more than 20 years of in-depth Heyer in my life, which I wasn't expecting, I have to say, you know, and all the Heyers on the shelf behind me, I'm still in awe of her ability, and writing a Regency, it just drives home more than ever the fact that she created the genre and she created the world. And now, yes, modern readers, many modern writers are broadening and widening, as we need to, you know, making the world more inclusive, more colourblind, all of that. But she still created the archetypes of that as a fictional world. Now, it's steeped and rooted in solid history, but it is a slice, and it has certain artificialities attached to it as well. but it's still a world that is real for the reader and that was real for her. And so if I could achieve a tithe of what she achieved, I'd be happy, but who knows? So, you know, there's a lot to learn from her, but probably character, perhaps more than anything, because her books are all character driven.
Does feel like a lovely place to end now that we're all sitting here smiling and remembering how much we love Georgette Heyer. It's been such a delight to talk to you today, ladies. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Hello, I'm Jax Thomas, a lifetime Heyer fan and also director of Bologna Book Plus. And I'm delighted to be chairing this session discussing the business of publishing Georgette Heyer 100 years after the publication of her first book. It's the most enormous pleasure to welcome our panelists today, internationally respected publisher Dominique Raccah, CEO of Sourcebooks, based in the USA, and Joanna Reynolds, CEO of the long-standing and famous Folio Society, based here in the UK. I think I speak for all of us when I say how pleased we are to be contributing to this International Georgette Heyer Convention and continuing the conversation from our Heyer Unconference of February this year, the content of which is now available via this conference. So firstly to you, Dominique, Heyer in the US, was she always popular, or have you created the market?
Well, she was deeply popular at one point, and then when we started publishing her in 2007, many of her books were out of print in the United States. And what we discovered was a very hungry market that had been waiting to have them available again. So before our trade paper editions, Heyer had been published in that smaller mass market format. And we put a tremendous amount into the launch of those trade paperbacks and really created that market for the larger format. And since 2007, we've sold 2.3 million books, both in P and E. So, you know, it was amazing to me. I remember being at a conference at Winter Institute when we were introducing these books back into the market to our independent book-selling partners, and the excitement that people were saying, "My God, I thought these were gone. We couldn't get them," and the sheer joy of taking an author who is beloved and who I love and have loved, you know, for my whole life, and bringing them into further dissemination and growing that has been just a gift.
Did she have a good library market throughout?
Yes,
you know,
yes.
the last 100 years?
In the mass market, in those mass market editions were largely available in libraries. But you know, the way that Harlequin had been her previous publisher had done it was, as you know, with mass markets, they take them out of print, you know, and of course, as a result, I mean, incredibly, I remember calling Deb Worksman, who's her editor, and saying, how is it possible that Frederica is out of print in the United States? I mean, how is that even the beginnings of a thing that we should be considering, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So there you go.
Well, before I ask Joanna a sort of similar question about the UK market, just Dominique, you said you're a lifelong fan yourself. How did you stumble across Heyer? Is it a mother-daughter
Libraries. You're absolutely right, Jax. So I think I think I've said this to you privately at some point, that I'm an immigrant and came to the United States not speaking any English. I was born and raised in Paris, and when I was about 8 years old, and I learned to speak English through libraries. Really, I mean, my parents were too busy; they shipped me off to the library, and there I discovered really my life. Actually, I would say, And at some point, a very wise librarian put into my hands Georgette Heyer, and I devoured them all. I mean, I remember going to the shelf and going, is there another one? Is there another one? Is there one I read? And then there was that fabulous table at the very front of those books that had them in chronological order so that you could know, like, oh, I really like this one. I bet she wrote another one that's like near that same time. So then you identified them more specifically. Yeah, I was a huge fan, and it was such a gift.
I think we're all terribly lucky that when we discovered Georgette Heyer, she'd finished writing. And so the entire collection was there. You liked one and you just knew that you could gorge yourself on all of these Georgette Heyer. How did you discover them, Joanna?
I don't know who introduced me to her, but I grew up in the depths of the country in Wiltshire. And there was there's a market in the middle of Bath, covered market, beautiful market, still there. And there's a secondhand bookstall. And in fact, that's also still there, amazingly. And I used to have a paper round, and anything I earned from that, whenever we went into Bath, I'd scuttle into this market and find Georgette Heyer books, and really whatever they had, I just bought whatever they had because I didn't have there were no libraries anywhere near us or anything else. So I just bought whatever they'd got. And I've still got them with my name written in them, and where I bought them. And I, like Dominique and you, I read them all. I mean, I knew what I didn't have. I used to get a list by the end, and I just read them all.
I think they were our Netflix, really, weren't they? We all
and also where I grew up, obviously, near Bath and all. There's quite a lot of her books that are actually written around where I was brought up. And what I loved about it is I wasn't part of the sort of Regency elite, obviously, but I was kind of more part of Arabella's, chimney person coming down the chimney. So. And my grandfather's and all my father's family were shepherds. So the whole thing because horses are really important in Georgette Heyer. So all of that, it really resonated with me. And I loved the fact she brought women, the women were really strong. And she also did bring the whole of society in, not just the kind of the high bit of society. I liked that. And I loved the fact that, lots of the women didn't come from that background and just kind of winged it. It was brilliant.
So, well, it's a centenary. I mean, the Black Moth. I mean, amazingly, she wrote that when she was 17. It's absolutely extraordinary, to be honest. And moving to Folio, I think, is this the first Georgette Heyer that you've published? And you do beautiful enhanced editions. What made Heyer a contender?
Here it is. We're just about to publish it. So it was me, really, to be honest. We were talking about going into new genre. We were into fantasy and sci-fi, children's. Obviously, we do lots of non-fiction and everything as well. And the area we hadn't really, we've got Rebecca and obviously Austen and stuff, but romance as a genre we'd not really looked at. And I started talking about Georgette Heyer. And then when Tom, my publishing director, and I were in the States, because I wasn't sure, because the US is our biggest market, it's really important for us, the States. So when we were in New York, we were talking to people and saying, what do you think? So, Kirkus and Tor and New York Times and the New Yorker and stuff. And one of the women we talked to said, you should be publishing into romance and Georgette Heyer. And I went, aha, great. That's great, because we realized then there was a good strong market in the US too. And the other thing that's really important to us is social media. And of course she's an author that's got masses and masses of social media exposure and groups and people that are interested, which is brilliant for Folio, absolutely brilliant. So we're very excited. It's publishing in the autumn. We're very excited about it, and here it is. This is the first time I've seen it today. So.
And coordinates very nicely with that wallpaper behind you.
Yes.
So Dominique, this is a little bit of a behind the scenes look at the business of publishing. And does the centenary give you a massive commercial uplift, or is it passing us all by and we're just very happy to have Heyer on tap all the time?
Well, here's the thing. I think Heyer enthusiasts always look for an opportunity to talk about their favorite author and to suggest her books to other readers. So her birthday, we've actually done huge promotions for her birthday, for new editions, for the centenary. You know, Heyer is beloved and celebrated, and we will take all opportunities to preach Heyer.
Spread the word.
Yes, to spread the word.
And is there a big Regency market in the US then? I mean, I've tapped into the Jane Austen, but is there?
Of course, Bridgerton's, you know, so, but I think beyond that as well, and there always has been a real, you know, I mean, the Regency is such a strange period, right? Because it was such a short period, but we've actually, you know, created a huge set of libraries out of this very short period of history.
I think Bridgerton did really raise some of the sort of excitement around around romance and stuff, though. I mean, certainly we've noticed there's been an increase of interest in this area, and we did a bit of research to our customers to say, what books would you be interested in us publishing? And Georgette Heyer, for the first time, came right up there. And I think that, again, is a reflection of what's happening in the sort of the media market.
Did we all watch Bridgerton?
Totally agree. You know, all of the Regency romance writers are enjoying what we could call the Bridgerton effect. So thank you very much, Julia Quinn and Shondaland and all of those associated. So, and Netflix, of course.
Taking your clothes off, that was helpful.
You know, it's been absolutely great to see Heyer's name brought up in countless articles and media regarding the rise and success of the Regency subgenre. And in fact, I just saw a journalist who said, without Heyer, Bridgerton would not exist. And that, I thought, okay, that, you know, I think we get that she developed this for us all.
I think that quote is long overdue. There was quite a lot of online debate, certainly, around when Bridgerton was airing, about the fact that Georgette Heyer was not getting enough credit. So I'm very pleased to see a slightly more respect for her. So do you, with all of this Regency publishing and sort of interest, is there a Regency sort of companion non-fiction book that you're tempted to publish, Dominique? Or?
Well, we have published, and I think I have it here actually, but we've published Jennifer Kloester's Georgette Heyer's Regency World, right? And of course, that is, you know, that's been fabulous because it has all of the background and the nomenclature. And I mean, we have to admit that the Regency has its own language. And we need a translator. We need to understand the culture and the world building and of course the clothes, which have their own dictionary. So
I hope you've got your reticule by your side.
By my side, indeed.
Of course.
And you know,
hanging from my wrist.
Yes.
And you know, you just have this sort of very charming kind of style of dress, right? I mean, that is all of that, right? So
absolutely
this
beautiful.
happens to be what I'm reading right now. So this is Lady of Quality.
Lady of Quality.
But you know,
a diamond of the first water was the Lady of Quality. A diamond of the first water.
Jax.
So let's on that note then, because unfortunately this is rather a short panel, but does anybody have a favorite Regency expression? Or I mean, that's one of my favorite ones.
I love doing it too brown. You know, you're doing it too brown. I have no idea what it actually means. It just means, you know, it's over the top in some way, I guess.
Yes, exactly. I think that's something that we could bring back, and the basis of a great social media campaign, I think.
I
Joanna,
think
do you
the
have anything?
dialogue, Jax, the dialogue is out of this world. That's what's so brilliant about this. I love
So
her.
dry, so
She
good.
also, I mean, her,
Marvelous.
you know, the humor is incredible, but the thing that is extraordinary about Heyer is that it's not just one character or two characters or three characters. It's that whole supporting cast, right? I mean, Frederica or Cotillion, right? I mean, it's the whole thing takes place in this enormous family, and you get to know everybody and all of it. And I think that actually is Bridgerton's, right? Because Bridgerton's is, of course,
yes.
the story of the family.
Yes, or different families. And weren't they clever with the costumes? I think they was absolutely superb with the costumes in Bridgerton. Well, I have to say, Dominique, I think your achievement, not only in learning English, but also learning Regency English, from not having spoken a word of English from the age of, until the age of 6, is quite extraordinary, only to be surpassed by selling 2.7 million copies of our favourite author. And congratulations to Joanna for making.
I can't wait to have that in my hands, Joanna. Congratulations. That is awesome.
Yeah, no, I think it's going to be, hopefully it's going to be great. 2.6 million would be a lovely number to sell.
Yes,
there's that. I think I only said, just so everybody's clear, I think I only said 2.3 million. So,
okay.
Oh, 2.3. I'm so
we can
sorry.
always hope, and there's more to be had for Heyer.
You're absolutely right. 2.3 million. What an achievement.
What an achievement. But this is
but
so
I hope
exciting.
by the end of this conference, another 400,000 will have shipped out
Your
of the door.
mouth to God's ears, Jax. Absolutely.
It is really exciting that we're doing it. I think this is brilliant.
Yes,
We are
brilliant.
Great.
Well, thank you very much indeed to Heyer Publishers, because it makes this chairperson very, very happy. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for having us, Jax. Such a great idea.
Yeah, thanks.
And Joanna, what a pleasure. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Hello, it's me again, Jax Thomas, a lifetime Heyer fan and also director of Bologna Book Plus. And I'm delighted to be chairing this second session discussing the business of publishing Georgette Heyer 100 years after the publication of her first book. It's brilliant to have our panelists for this session. Our first one is Lara Speicher, who is head of publishing UCL Press and also a fellow Heyer fan. Lara joined UCL in 2013 and worked with colleagues to set UCL Press up from scratch. She was previously commissioning editor at British Library Publishing. Dr. Samantha Rayner, reader and soon-to-be professor of publishing and book cultures at University College London, is our second panelist. As an ardent lifetime Georgette Heyer fan, she is co-author with Kim Wilkins of a collection of academic papers, Georgette Heyer, History and Historical Fiction, published by UCL Press earlier this year. So, Sam and Lara, such is my reticence, if not potential shame, of being a Heyer fan, I was reluctant to out you as Heyer fans without permission, but happily, no shame around this virtual table. So how did you both discover Heyer as readers?
Lara, do you want me to go first?
Yeah, go for it.
So, as is the way, I think, when the more you talk to Heyer fans, I think this is a sort of a familiar story, but it was my mother who introduced me to Georgette Heyer, probably when I was about 11 or 12. She had some of those old pan paperbacks on her bookshelves, the ones I call the cameo covers with the sort of circle in the middle.
Wonderful, magical.
Yes, and I think it was Sprig Muslin that was the first one that I read, and then just got hooked after that. And yes, they've just remained a constant throughout my life as sort of a go-to comfort read whenever, you just want something familiar and fun and light, but also, it's not frivolous. There's a good story. The characters and everything are great. So yes, I will openly admit now I am and always have been an ardent Heyer fan. What about you, Lara? How did you come to Heyer?
Well, I came across them first at university through a very dear friend of mine who was a completely voracious reader, and she read all the classics and would read lots of things that many of us struggled with, like Walter Scott and other really heavy fiction, and Dickens she devoured. So it was quite a surprise to me when I discovered that she was also an avid Georgette Heyer fan, who I didn't know a great deal about, and she introduced me, and I was similarly hooked straight away and read many of them. I haven't read any for quite a while, I must admit, and I think it's time I go back to them to reread and read the ones that I haven't already read. But I'm sure my friend read all of them at least twice, if not more.
Yeah.
So was she completely open about loving them? There was no hassle about that. She was totally confident.
She read absolutely everything and had no shame or inhibitions about any of her reading habits. It was wonderful.
I think the thing that I've taken from both of you there is the rereadability.
Yes.
And actually, how many books can you say that about? And that is something that I think is an absolute constant theme with Heyer fans, is the fact that they are reread and lovingly cherished on the shelves.
Yes.
So, but to bring us back to more important matters, why do both of you think, and I'll go to you first, Lara, I think. Well, why do you think Heyer works as a focus for academic research? And why did UCL Press feel this collection of essays was worth commissioning?
Well, it was exciting to me, first of all, as a Heyer fan, when Sam first told me about the conference. But really it was, when I heard more about the lack of research in the area and went along to some of the sessions of the conference and could see that this was a real gap, and that there are so many different angles that can be covered when studying Heyer, which are featured in the book, such as gender and genre and circulation and reception. And so, the chance to take something on that really could be taken more seriously as an area of study resonated with me. And we're always interested in publishing original research in areas that have previously been overlooked.
And just before I come back to you about how successful has it been in terms of your open access, Sam, you could perhaps give us some context around the conference and whence the essays came.
Yes, and this is interesting because it ties back to your first comment about being open, about being a Heyer fan. So my co-editor on this volume is the lovely Professor Kim Wilkins, who is also a publishing and creative writing lecturer in Queensland in Australia. And we'd actually met at a medievalisms conference in Lincoln a few years back. And I forget, it was over drinks or something, we got talking about things we liked reading, and she confessed to being a Heyer fan. And I said, I love Heyer too. We should so do a conference. And that's the conference that Lara was referring to. So we held a conference a couple of years after that at Senate House with the Institute of English Studies, who hosted that. We did a three-part thing, as you know, because one of the parts was your part. So we had a lovely Regency evening. So we had a social aspect. We had a creative writing aspect for people who wanted to write their own Regency novels. And then we had this sort of academic conference in the middle. And, I suppose we shouldn't be surprised, but it was lovely how strong the response was. People all over the world who came to give papers. And then Lara was there, and then we sort of struck up a conversation then and said, well, what about is there any scope, do you think, in publishing these some of these papers? Lara said yes, put in a proposal and we'll see what happens, and the rest is history. So it is part of that kind of, it's such fun to do. It almost doesn't feel like work. I know that. See, I'm still feeling slightly apologetic and defensive about it. But I cannot tell you, Kim and I had the best time putting this together and being able to talk to these researchers from around the world with, as Lara says, all these different perspectives on Heyer has been amazing. And it does make you sort of hold your head up and say, well, yes, you know, she has got a lot to offer, and there's so many different ways of looking at her accomplishments and the impact that she's had on other writers. So yes, it's just been an amazing adventure from start to finish.
And this international fan base, which this conference, of course, completely exemplifies, because it's taking place in Melbourne and there's delegates from all over the world. So that's absolutely fabulous. So Lara, how successful has the volume been as an OA download? And also there is a physical book, which is a beautiful book.
Here it is.
Yes, we make all our books available freely online as open access, but also in print form, as Sam has shown, and it's done really well. So since it was published at the end of February, there have been over 5,000 downloads.
Wow.
It's sold over 300 copies in print, and it's been downloaded in nearly 100 countries around the world. So you can
That's
see the
pretty impressive.
Yeah, and considering that a typical scholarly book will have average print sales of between 200 and 300 copies around the world in its lifetime, and this has sold 300 already in only half a year or so, I think really shows that, well, both that Heyer is very popular and that there's a real appetite for more books about her work. As we were saying before, the lack of serious studies of her work. But I must also say it's all been helped by the enthusiastic promotion of the book by the editors.
Thank you. And by the conferences, I mean, we're not by any means, that's the other thing this year, you know, I think we've become more aware of where these pockets of research are happening. Jennifer Kloester, for example, is Heyer's biographer, also in Australia, is sort of the world expert on Heyer and her life. And now there is this Heyer Society and this very conference that we're part of today. You know, there is much more visibility around Heyer research, which is just lovely to see.
And our February unconference was certainly a great lockdown pursuit, wasn't it?
It was.
So,
Yes.
So how is Heyer research developing more widely around the world? I mean, we've touched on that, but is there anything more formal that you can tell us about? Sam, why don't you start?
I can try. I feel this perhaps isn't my place. I mean, it is that there is this International Heyer Society that's again started in the last 12 months or so, and that has got, you know, some very eminent, very well respected academics as part of that. What I think is great about Heyer research, though, is it brings together academics with sort of with readers of the books in a way where the conversation is kind of mutually respectful and open, and people listen to everybody else's opinions. So this way where academia can sometimes seem quite separate from, you know,
yes,
normal people read. Heyer has this amazing ability to connect people of all ages. Everybody's got a story about how they came to Heyer in the first place, and I think that's where Heyer research will come. You know, Lara mentioned the reception of Heyer works, but, you know, there's lots of work to be done. There's a paper in the book that sort of brought together data collection on various things. It was absolutely fascinating. And I'm hoping there's going to be a lot more of that. Now that there is this International Heyer Society, there should be much more scope for people somewhere that people can get together and a kind of central hub for things.
Yes, so basically you want to hear from everybody who's at the conference.
Absolutely, yes.
And Lara, do you have anything to add on that in terms of research developing more widely in the world?
Well, I think Sam, I think is you know, best placed to, you know, to answer that one. But clearly from the reception there's been to this book, I think, as I mentioned before, it's clear that there is an appetite for more study of Heyer and possibly other similar writers.
So that, I mean, so next generation hair, I mean, what do you think the future of hair inspired work is going to be like, and where do you think it's going to come from? I mean, dare I mention the B word, Bridgerton?
Well, I was actually going to answer that with exactly, you know, that thought that, you know, if Netflix haven't already got their eye on Heyer novels, then they probably will at some point.
I think Bridgerton will undoubtedly help bring more readers through to Heyer. It, you know, it can only help up Regency romance in the general public's consciousness. But yes, I hope that they do make that leap, because between the four of us, I know there's nobody else listening. I think Heyer has a lot more to offer than what Bridgerton does in terms of just in, you know, plot development and characterization and the language use and everything that Heyer uses. And it is a private reading experience. It's something that you get a lot of pleasure reading the words on the page. So I'm not sure whether Heyer actually would translate as well to a television or a film experience. I think there was one terrible attempt once, wasn't there, to do one of the books as a film. So I don't know. Again, who knows? Watch this space, maybe.
Well, I suppose just as Andrew Davis sort of made Jane Austen a little more smouldering, you'd have to have, the scriptwriter would be interesting, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Okay, so let's take it back to fandom. And what's your favourite Heyer expression or character or word? I'm being quite kind because I'm giving you lots of scope there to answer favourite Heyer stuff.
I could take this one with an example from the publication of the book, if you like. So the original conference that we had at Senate House was called the Nonesuch, you know, to sort of draw on Heyer's incomparability as a writer. And that was really the word that we wanted to put in the title of the collection of essays.
Yeah.
But we had a really interesting to and fro with UCL Press, not with Lara, I have to say, because this is sort of during the production process. And we realized that actually to reach the widest possible audience, words that like the Nonesuch, that to people that read Heyer a lot are, well, everybody knows what that means, were perhaps not the best.
A non-pareil of a word. I mean, really,
exactly. Yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, maybe we should have used that one, but that would have sort of defeated the object of, you know, the reference to the Heyer thing. But it was a very interesting conversation with somebody that wasn't a Heyer fan, sort of being quite categorical and saying, no, you can't use that because people won't know. And Kim and I, who were Heyer fans, saying, but of course everybody knows what this word is. So, you know, I think Heyer, we have to appreciate that as Heyer fans, we learn things that perhaps everybody's not privy to. It's like being part of a secret club, isn't it? And knowing what Hessians
I guess,
are.
and for a conference, you want to bring new people in who are keen to know about Heyer. So if they don't understand the title of the conference and or the book, you're not going to get them as delegates or readers. Yeah. Lara, how about you? Do you have a bit of a favourite or?
Do you know, I don't remember enough specifically to answer that, and I have to admit, it's been a while since I've read any, but I'm just having this conversation and working with everyone on the book. I'm just dying to dive back into them again now. So sorry to be unprepared on that.
I'm sure there would be something with I might raise one quizzical brow and.
There are things like sarsenet, you know, there's sort of fabrics that you read and then you think, I have a vision of what sarsenet is, but actually I have no clue what it is. I'm sure it's not what I think it is. Or is it ratafia? How do you say the drink?
Ratafia or ratafia. Which one? Yes, which is it?
Wonderful words to read on the page, but, you know, yes.
And our lovely previous panelist, Dominique from Sourcebooks, of course, has helpfully published a companion and all sorts of things to Heyer, because, you know, there needs to be a glossary of terms, doesn't there, for some of these things. Certainly we found that with the carriages, I think.
Yes.
Anyway, thank you very much indeed for thank you for being at the apex of academia and fandom. It's great. You're doing great work.
Thank you, Jax.
Thank you so much, Lara and Sam. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jax.